We have our final leg of a long, fabulous 2 days of seminars. Thank you for those of you who've been here almost all the time. I think Robert might be part of our, and Dagmar are kind of like our hardy constants. But so we're going to just have an open panel discussion. I've asked Deborah and Jonathan, who spoke yesterday, to kind of kick us off with some responses to what they heard today. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, Deborah Douglas is Director of Collections and Curator of Science and Technology at the MIT Museum, as well as a research associate with the MIT Program in Science, Technology, and Society. And Jonathan Dehan is an artist and programmer, and who developed the interactives for the Interface Experience exhibition. And David Coven and Jennifer have been here all day. So do you want to start us off, Deborah?
Sure. I have a lot of questions, but I'll start out with one which has to do with your thoughts, or each of your thoughts on this, is does all this digital activity, is there something about, some quality about digital media, digital interfaces, the way in which you have to teach your students, produce a kind of homogeneity in style and approaches? And I say that because a lot of large technological systems are highly centralized, authoritarian, and in their nature. And so is there something about this that will make our museums more homogeneous in the long run? So that's a provocative question, and you can take it any way you want.
Oh, well, I have a question back. So more homogeneous than labels?
Ooh, volley.
No, yes. Yeah. No, I actually wasn't thinking so much about the label per se, but I've noticed, for example, I think one of the pernicious effects of Aztec, for example, is the homogenization of the American Science Center. That they look and feel the same everywhere you go. You see the same Bernoulli exhibit, the same effects. Sometimes that's because it's the same show, just traveling around, cycling. But
That's like the bestseller phenomenon too. Actually, we were talking about lunch. Yeah, in some ways.
I'm really interested. Is there something about the nature of the technology that will reshape our museums?
So I have an answer that's part of the student pitch I give at orientation and Accepted Students Day, is because I think it depends on how you approach the technology. I think the people at this table, I wouldn't have that concern with our approaches. And so what we do here, and what I tell the students, is that the digital is just another set of tools. Like, we start with the humanities-based question. People come into the lab and ask me if they can work on a project, and it's like that you're really like, you just want to use the tool. That's not based in the intellectual question, which is where we start from. And if you start with that intellectual question and integrate both academic research as the foundation for building the discourse that you're going to deal with, and then really think about design before you even get to the digital, like design of experience, then it's just a medium at that point. It doesn't become a set of aesthetics or ideological parameters that you cave into. It's more malleable in your hands. And the digital medium is something we really like. Maybe we've scratched 2% of its possibility at a high end. Like, we're going to keep on discovering. Like, we're still in a high stage of remediation. So if things are homogenized, it's because we don't know how to make it not look like books well enough yet. And so that's, I think I'd like to say we've been successful. If you see the things that have been in the Focus Gallery, they all look totally different. They're all very customized to the shows. They use the typography, like, so for instance, David's typography, that was the typography that the art director picked for the wall. Like, so it was a conscious, really intellectual decision that played out through the whole intellectual project. The typographer for my book led the typography for the rest of my show, including the app. And the art director picked it because it was a font that someone had designed at Bell Labs in the 70s with the oncoming digital screens as a thought provoker. And it ended up being the font that turned into Verdana which is now this ubiquitous thing. So it's actually got this historical arc to it. So if you embed all that stuff in your practice, it doesn't, you can't get homogeneous. Actually, the problem is it gets too custom, and then it's actually harder to, iterate and things like that. So.
Well, sorry, Jennifer.
No, no, okay.
I was going to say, and I think we can make that a little bit more specific even and say, I think one problem is sort of the intersection of interface design combined with a not particularly rigorous approach to experience design, which is, I think, fairly typical of museums, is where it gets problematic. And here, I think specifically about like mobile apps, like how many museum apps have sort of like perfunctory functionality where it's like, you can tweet from here for some reason. We don't know, or here's a slideshow for some reason.
Yeah.
And those things are in there because they're easy to build, not because they're always necessarily the thing that needs to be done.
Or they're buying preset. I mean, they sell these
Well,
other conferences we go to. There are companies
and-
that are selling preset device platforms, and they're really homogenized
Right.
because they're.
And that's where you get into problems because a museum has sort of bought into the idea of like we have to have a mobile app, and that's the impetus as opposed to like here's the thing that you can only do via a mobile app, which obviously informs a very particular design. So I think where you do see homogeneity is probably there. That said, I think that's the thing that I'm saying all day today is like something, and then that said, let me that said, it's like I think we're getting better at it. I mean, I think we'll start to figure it out. I'm not really too worried about that kind of homogeneity over the long term. I think we're still very much in the early years of this.
And I think, so my question about the labels, actually, I think Kimon ended up hitting up on what I was really pushing at with that, which was the idea that the digital is just a tool in the same way that labels are just a vehicle for the content, right? And the fact that labels happen in every museum doesn't mean that they're all exactly the same. And I think that also this idea of like those, the kind of preset apps, the preset, and they're mostly like CMSs, right? Like, I mean, I think a lot of that just has to do with the differences in size and capacity that different museums have. And it kind of is the same as other types of things that people get into, where you have, if you have more limited capacity, then maybe that kind of CMS thing is something that makes sense for that museum. Whereas there are other museums that are in a position to be able to kind of push at things. So I think that because there are always going to be some places that through a variety of circumstances might have the opportunity to start pushing at things. And I think that that's going to kind of counter what might move toward homogeneity.
Can I play devil's advocate and just say, like, it's not necessarily a bad thing if there's homogeneity from museum to museum? Now, not between the entire experience, but for small, like, expectations that people might have. I think the expectation that that someone could open, like, their camera app and get additional information just by pointing it at an object is something that it'd be really nice to not have to educate people on that if a museum has that support, right? Mm-hmm. So like, there are a lot of specific like problems with that. You go to a museum that just doesn't have the resources to provide that, then people will be like, oh, damn, I don't have this.
Don't have that,
But for the most part, I think like having some common language so that people can orient themselves and so that people can know like what to expect. So like the wall labels, when they first came out, right? People did have to learn how to use them. Yeah. and now it's like a common thing, and that's not a bad thing, and each museum can still have their own character and decide what they're putting on those labels. Mm-hmm. And sure, some of them don't put in a ton of effort, and they just like kind of put in like a data table, and you see that everywhere, but other museums use it as an opportunity to be creative, and that's just like a medium to do that.
I would think one of the challenges would be, I was thinking about this when I spoke about the New York City collections and trying that what we need and also are things like middleware projects and products that would aggregate more and more, material from different institutions, that it makes it very hard. I mean, each institution obviously has great investment in its own collections database, and even if they're using, certain similar database products, but for the larger users, people are less interested in, this is in this institution, this is in this institution, but I'm looking for something across multiple institutions, and I want to sort of aggregate New York City material from this era of this type, and that is still very difficult.
Well, it probably is going to be for a little while, but I also think that a lot of institutions are sort of moving toward, openness, but I also think just even using the same conventions. What is the one for art museum databases? It's like the language is done for libraries, so that you're all cataloging the same way.
Sure.
And I've now forgotten what it's called.
Oh, the one that Getty.
I keep wanting to say Lido, but it's the other one.
Getty.
We're terrible experts.
I know, right? Like, yes, it's got a name, and it takes a
Sounds
second
like-
to not come up with.
Kona is the one that I was thinking of.
So I mean, I think that a
Yeah.
lot of museums are sort of moving in the direction of, starting to use systems that have it so that we're all talking the same language.
Yeah.
Which needs to happen before we can even get to the point where that kind of, connectivity is going to make
Yeah,
sense.
no.
It might be good to just say what that is, or does everyone in this room know
I mean, it's
what a
basically like,
vocabulary is?
it's basically like a system so that you're talking about the same cataloging language, so that, the system, the database at Museum X is talking the same way as the database at Museum Y. So in the same way so that libraries can talk to each other through that other thing that they can't today.
Well, but David, actually, I think your middleware question is a really interesting one about, how much our back-end technologies inform the front-end interface decisions that we
Yes.
make. Like for instance, if let's say your average collection database emphasized the collection or the capture of narrative material over sort of fielded record database type material, how much differently that would inform our approach to kind of designing interfaces, because we would have these long flowing narratives that are maybe difficult to sort of aggregate or search, but also a wonderful experience in and of their, on their own. So I don't know, I feel like there's something there, to that, that seriously.
I think it's more than something there. It's because there really is the epistemology of the back end does it does a lot of heavy lifting on what you can do with the front end. And as we've, like the projects that David and I have gone through, like there were choices made for back end that we either went with or went against in a sequence. So just going through the Visualizing New York project, it started as an Omeka project because Omeka had this possibility for doing digital exhibitions, and it had this exhibit builder plugin that was relatively easy to use, but its themes were awful, right? So we chose it because it would ingest object information real well. It was built as an object management system, so it had that epistemology, but its front end was awful, and it just hadn't caught up. And so the decision to go to
George
the
Mason folks watching from home.
but this was also it was 5 years ago, and it's much better, right?
5 years ago.
No, it was 2010, and that's been rectified, and we've moved forward a lot. We use Omeka for a ton of things now. So then we came back the second semester. The students were like, well, the back end doesn't matter to us as much because we're making an outward facing thing, and the epistemology of the tool and its functions is actually limiting us. And so that's why we went ahead and decided to do like a fully custom CSS HTML site. But the benefit was that we were able to lean on the CMS of the NYPL because all the stuff was there already. So we just, rather than building our own backend, reiterating all the objects, we just linked to the objects in the digital gallery the NYPL had. So the existing backend data structure defined that. And then when we moved forward to creating the new project, we were like, oh, we should use Omeka because we're maybe institutional investment in this, and we want to make it object-based. And the developers came back and went, your project really isn't object-based, it's essay-based. It's narrative-based. There's not a ton of objects in there. It's essay-based. And so WordPress makes more sense because WordPress is a much more ubiquitous platform, and they could do a lot more than reverse engineering and doing stuff with Omeka. And the mandate of the object backend wasn't important enough to overwhelm what was necessary for that WordPress would provide for. And then my project was the same thing. Is like it was more about visuals and text, so we used WordPress again. But there are other projects where Omeka makes a lot of sense for us, or where they are very object based. And so I think that that's a really big story, and that's why I think the growing the APIs and the what is in those databases that's going to be linked across museums, and what that story is going, like how much of it is going to be narrative and interpretive, how much is that going to make sense to share, whether or not that'll be an interesting middleware conversation over the next 5-10 years. And I think that's the one we haven't gotten into in depth yet, but we're on the edge and ready to jump into with all the the stuff Cooper Hewitt's done with their API and all the open link data conversations.
And I think actually Cooper Hewitt makes an interesting counterexample to what you're saying, in the sense that they either did recently or are in the process of, basically dismantling their old gigantic heavyweight Drupal-based backend for their website and replacing that with WordPress. And that decision was made not on the basis of functionality to the user, but was really based on the fact that they needed to get their staff using the CMS, and that Drupal was just really difficult for their staff to use. So they made a decision saying, paramount for us now is to get a CMS that our staff is capable of using, and then that necessarily is going to constrain what features they're able to deliver.
I had another question which relates to your impressions, both in your own institutions and beyond. Are these digital interfaces a way to open the door, or do they exacerbate some of the socioeconomic class issues that we have with different communities?
It's interesting, this actually came up in a question earlier. I think one of the things that's really interesting in thinking about that, it's an important question, and I think it's an important question for museums across the field, but I don't think that it, on its own, I don't think that tech on its own is exacerbating that. I feel, or the problem, because I think one of the things is that in looking at some of the research that's been done about who's using what types of devices, one thing that I've seen come up quite a bit is a lot of discussion about how people are accessing the internet, and that if you are in kind of the lower, like 40% of, or at least certainly the 20% of, like in SES, like the socioeconomic status, the way that people are accessing the internet is almost entirely through mobile devices. So, for groups of people that we think of as people who often have hurdles to access museums, mobile is actually potentially a place that can be leveraged to reach out in ways that are really interesting, because there won't be a desktop at home. There won't, that really is the way in which they're accessing the internet. So it's like sort of something to think about with that. But at the same time, I can't point to a museum that is leveraging that well. But I think that there's potential there.
Other experiences people have had?
I'll say that, and we've gone down the academic route, and we're just not even thinking about it. I think that's what's so phenomenal about the Cleveland project is, your thing is so embedded into your entire institution's identity at this point. And I think a lot of these are still appendices to identity. And every time you talk, Jen, it's like these new data, and it's so real. And it's a really challenge for us to think about those things, and it's hard. I think the socioeconomic box gets checked off even after the accessibility box gets checked off, and we often don't even make it to that one because it's so overwhelming, and there's such an impetus, just like in my project, to do the next new thing, and it's so great to do the design, and so I think it's really hard, and I think it's. From our perspective, we would have to follow the lead of the bigger institutions that are really able to think about it, and also think about it with big numbers of attendance, where you can actually get real statistics. And I think that's what's great. You have so many people now coming in and using this thing. You know who the user audience is, and you can get some feedback about the story of that device.
Sure, we definitely do. At the same time, it's I can't say that we're definitively reaching.
Yeah, right.
You know, and that's, you know, it's like, I mean, it's one of those things that we actually do.
At least
think
you know
about.
that, though.
And we talk a lot about it, and we talk a lot about it beyond tech and beyond mobile and beyond all that sort of, I mean, institutionally, as basically every institution does, right? Like, these are conversations that are going on. And I think that, you know, some of the larger conversations that we're having with respect to that are, you know, kind of changing what has been, I think, reasonably typical historical practice at many, many, many museums, which is to say, we have these things, and these people should want to come to us. This group of people should want to come to us because we have these things. And we're trying to kind of turn that around and you know, actually say, well, what do you need from us? And I think that when it comes to digital, when it comes to mobile, that turn of conversation needs to happen as well. And I don't see it happening yet. Because it's like you said, you're sort of like, how are we gonna get this big project out? How are we gonna, and so that, you know, it's sort of getting back to the thing we were saying this morning about having that built-in reflection time to really
Right,
think
yeah.
about, like, how are we going to tackle this? And because I think a lot of us are kind of on that, you know, wheel, there's not a lot of that built in.
I just know impressionistically that we have different constituencies, and boy, they have you know, they just come in and it's really different for them, and some things are really big barriers. Our name is a huge barrier for a whole community of people. I mean, forget, you know, it's free. We live right next to a low-income housing project, but the number of visitors we get from that
In the same
is,
situation.
is, you know, is
You're not even
non-existent,
our
and it's
museum,
not,
right?
and it's not even for lack of outreach or effort but, so it's just, it's an interesting, situation, but we were kind of intrigued by when the Perkins School for the Blind, a couple of years ago, redid their museum. And has anyone been there? So it's worth a stop at some point, because it inverts everything you think you know about a museum design. So for starters, it has to be super well lit. Not, which seems counterintuitive, right? The primary visitors are blind. What do they care? You could have it in the dark, right? What difference does it make, right?
Except for the,
Except for
Spectrum of
there's a
visual
spectrum of
impairment.
visual impairments,
Sure,
right?
yeah, of course.
Things, the please touch things have to be embedded in a way that you don't trip or kill yourself with it. So everything is opposite, but you don't have to make your lights pretty. Big, giant, grotesque fluorescent lights are great. So it really, and so the successful museum there is driven by an entirely different set of criteria. It's a fascinating exercise, you know, to go through. I would encourage anyone to do something like that, some kind of experience like that, because it makes all your own personal assumptions and biases, it lays them all out on the surface.
Perhaps Columbia is publishing something on the experience they had with the Oma Bearden exhibit in the Wallach Art Gallery, because they hired the former director of the Museo de Barrio in the Bronx as director. And since the Wallach Art Gallery space is moving out of being hidden in a campus building, which is really tricky to access, so it's a huge barrier for just getting in, because you need to find it. So you see all the time people being lost on campus and not figuring out where to go. That they get a dedicated space for the first time in their history, actually, in the new north expansion of campus, which was very controversial with regard to destroying that part of the city and really negatively impacting part of the community. And they now have, I've heard a talk by the director recently, they now have really the explicit task to also have outreach to the community in Harlem to get them into the space. And they tried this with the Oma Bearden exhibit, which they had still on campus, and it's really tricky and very difficult to find into access space. And they did a lot of work just trying to get people in, and that seems to have been quite successful, but it seems to have primarily have worked really through going into schools. So it was very closely linked with Teachers College and sort of going through schools and then getting the word out with regard to family events and talks. But it was basically working for the school network.
Jonathan, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, so I had two questions, and I kind of want to say them at the same time because they're very different, and then you can pick which one
Sure,
you'd want to
fair enough.
answer.
That's a good strategy.
Yeah, so
Rip the Band-Aid off.
so yeah, so one of them, so how museums are introducing technology or have already introduced technology, there seems to be like into the gallery space specifically. From what Colin was talking about earlier, it seemed more about the hypothesis and slowly introducing an idea that involved technology to test that hypothesis. So there were these like, I wouldn't say slow actually, because like the time frames are very quick, but low risk, just like, hey, let's try this thing, and being very deliberate about it. And then not that there wasn't any deliberation or anything like that, but like with the Cleveland, just having a dedicated, massive space and trying to make it not overwhelming, but for people when they walk in the door, they have a set of expectations like, okay, I'm going to be interacting with a lot of technology right now that is about the art and it's about the stories and it's about myself, but their like mode of thinking was, okay, I'm not going to be afraid right now, hopefully, when they walk in the door. And what, like when I got brought to the Metropolitan Museum as like a technologist, where they didn't really know what that meant and were like what they wanted, right? No, they knew, like they've been using it for a while, but like they didn't have a specific role for me, right? Like I kind of set the task for myself to remove screens from the galleries. They thought I was coming in to bring more glowing screens into rooms, like
Because you're into technology, right?
Yeah. So like,
So obviously
So
that's
they
your
walked
thing.
you in and
Yeah.
they said, here's the rail, we're all.
Here's the railing where the iPad goes. Let me know when it's ready.
yeah, just sprinkle it around, right?
Just put a T on it, like a sticky, a T, like everywhere you want, like, technology here.
As if the rail wasn't a technology
Yeah, right.
either.
Yeah.
That's the good history.
And the Damascus room that was just up on screen. For the designs, that was your design, right? For it was like on the iPhone, and one of the
Looked
rooms
great.
was
Yeah.
it looked
Carlin's
very
project.
pretty. Carlin, good job. But
So he'll like, no.
that Damascus room, you didn't see it in that shot, but just to the left of that shot, there is a bright glowing screen that, like, if you try and be contemplative in that space, you can't. And there's like beautiful things there, but like the color balance is all off. I don't know about you, but like anyone with a screen near me, I can't not know it. Anyway, so what I wanted to ask was kind of already asked earlier, but I just love to hear more thoughts on where do you see our like treatment of technology in a way that like it can remove its focus, right? Remove the focus from the technology, remove it. Maybe ubiquitous computing is like something you could talk about, but yeah, I think like the only museum that's used technology in a very deliberate way recently to pull out the expectation is and this is without using it, was the Cooper Hewitt pen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like hearing also again from Carlin, like this is a great research tool because I don't take out my screen and look at my screen and type in numbers, or I don't take out my notebook and write down a bunch of session numbers. I just point it and then put it in my pocket again. It becomes a piece of technology that is not really a medium. It's not in between you and your experience, or it's not mediating your experience. It's just there, kind of auxiliary. Anyway, any thoughts on?
Oh, am I going? Okay. I mean, I think it's a really interesting and a really interesting suite of questions that you asked. So, I mean, the first one is actually something that Jennifer and I were talking a little bit about yesterday when we were trying to determine if there was any commonality between the presentations we were going to give this morning. in that, there's a very big difference between introducing a bunch of really high impact technology at once versus introducing it sort of very slowly. And I think the impact there is on a couple of paths. I mean, one is for your visitors. Like in your case, almost literally overnight, it was like that you were suddenly in a very different museum with a whole bunch of different things to learn. Whereas, a sort of slower IV drip of technology introduction allows your users to become a little bit more acclimated to like, oh, okay, when you're at the Blanton Museum, here are the kinds of affordances that are available. But also it gives your staff a chance to acclimate in a different way too. Your staff gets used to, oh, there's technology around. And one issue I think at the Met was always that certain like curatorial areas tended to move faster than others as far as that sort of adoption, which would lead to things where it's like you'd have very heavily mediated parts of the museum and then other parts where there was not. So there was, there wasn't like a common experience across those spaces. So that's me kind of not answering the first part of your question. Now let me kind of not answer the second part of your question, which is...
Have you answered a question yet?
It's not really my way. To the issue of kind of removing mediation, which is something that I'm extremely concerned with, I don't know yet. I mean, like the pat answer is, if you understand the experience and you understand the user goals, like you're likely to design something that's going to be less obtrusive because you'll have thought through the experience end to end, as opposed to just like thinking that you're going to introduce a big screen into the space and it somehow will not alter the rest of the experience in any way, which is not true. But I mean, I can say, at the Blanton, we've started to experiment with little things of like actually targeting mediation in different ways. Like, we ended up not doing it for Witness, the show that I was talking about during the talk, but one of the things that we were originally talking about doing was having ambient music that would play during the show, which is kind of controversial in art museums. I mean, like curators are either like pretty much all on board or just like no, never under any circumstances. And frankly, like for the first time we had a curator who was sort of like kind of ambivalent about it. He was like, maybe, and so one thing that we did talk about doing was like, well, what would happen if we just introduced that mediation 2 hours out of every day, where we said like, if you come to this show between 4:30 and 6:30, that's the rock and roll hour, basically. And if that's the kind of experience you want to have, it's there, and the rest of the time it won't be. So which is something that I don't think we think about a lot of like, what would that mean to just say like, you can have certain types of experiences during certain hours and not during others. And, that starts to become almost like a split test in a way, where you can say, well, as it turns out, like way more people show up during the rock and roll hour than not, or vice versa, and that tells you something. So,
I mean, I think the place that we end up thinking about that is not with, sort of digital projects or technology projects. The place that we think about that is with programming, like facilitated programming. Where, you say, okay, well, at this time, we're going to have this experience happen in the galleries for an hour. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as a program, right? But it is sort of doing the same thing, right? Where it's saying, you can come and have this facilitated experience, or you come at different times and you don't, right? Like, and so my suspicion is that having like the rock and roll hour and the not rock and roll hour will probably end up being very similar in some ways to the programming versus not programming, where there are some people that select to do that, and that's a great experience for them, and then there are other people who would prefer not, but that you have both groups. You know what I mean? But it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think we often don't think about that as a possibility. Like, we think of it as,
we don't.
It's like yes, no,
Or not.
in, out.
It's
That's
either always
it.
here or it is never here.
Right.
A quiet hour where all screens are off in the museum and you're not allowed to use your phones or anything like that.
Let's
That would be-
put that
It's like
art
Adult
critic
Swim in the
thing to the
public
test. Where it's like every 2 weeks, the New York Times does an editorial about how
Right.
museums should be a quiet place for contemplation. Like, let's put it to the test. Let's see if more people show up when we turn all the screens on.
You know, I think
Yeah, I think I'm ready.
You know,
Let's do it.
Many museums do that regularly anyway, due to technological.
the technology has been enforcing that commentary for decades.
I just think we haven't learned how to feature it. Instead of putting an out of order sign, we need to put, this is the museum's
enjoy
quiet
the
zone.
silence.
That's good.
It's just branding,
We, could,
folks.
we have stickers down the street we could change. That's an interesting idea.
Quiet out.
I mean, Jonathan, to take like an interesting perspective that we have, like we're constantly short-term exhibitions. So like our rate of iterative experimentation is very fast, which is great for us. And I think one thing that makes me feel like we've been really successful is that those screens have never not been a crucial, vital, important part of the exhibition design conversation. You know, they fit with the, you know, it goes back to Coven's comment about the typography. Like the typography on David's digital publication matched the typography on the wall label. You know, like that was explicitly chosen. Like, you know, thinking about how big a screen, where it's going to sit. I would say all of our interactives, we make sure that many of the objects that are in the space are in the interactive, so that there's a connection between the physical objects and the digital that makes sure you remember you're in the space and that this is part of a larger display and part of a larger tradition of exhibition design that has happened for, you know, hundreds of years now. And I find that I don't know if it's because I have spearheaded a lot of this, and I have a history as a scenic designer who did a lot of projection when I was doing my work and having those kinds of screens and spaces and that mediation. And if you do it intentionally, and if you do it carefully, and you do it in a way that isn't a distracting augmentation, then it shouldn't create this alienation. But I think that that's harder, like with a full collection and transitioning. And I think that's another thing that Art Lens and Gallery One did. It was like, okay, if we're going to do this, we just have to rethink the whole design of our space so that it fits.
And your organization, too.
Yeah, and your organization. And so that these aren't like, oh, we'll just like stick this here, you know? I think that David, would you agree that Amelia would say that that's one thing they're rethinking in the American wing with those touchscreens that they have in there? Like, they're great, and they were really a nice big first step, but they want to make them better, and they want to integrate them even more deeply into those rooms and reconceive of how the rooms are made.
Though, I mean, I think part of the move also to handhelds was also, and the charge we were given when we were doing these prototypes was explicitly, you know, trying to get people to move from room to room to make connections.
Yeah.
That this would, you know, it would fit in with some new wayfinding system to be named later.
Yeah, those digital are anchoring devices too. You have to be careful about that. Yeah.
And so you're moving from something that's a little more stationary, a little more dedicated to that particular room and the history of that room to something that spanned multiple rooms and made connections that were not apparent to a visitor otherwise. And so I don't know if that's a different stage or it's just, but it does move away from the sort of stationary, you know, screen where 3 people can look at it and the rest are either eyeing it jealously,
Right,
or
and
move on.
on like the pressure of the timetable, the people before and after them, right? You know,
Yeah.
being able to have your own device, being able to at your own leisure be part of that. Like, okay, I'm going to go here and then go here.
But there might be a reason why you put a big touchscreen somewhere. You know, like with David's project, like we wanted 2 big 27-inch touchscreens because we didn't want the images to be this big too. You know, you're looking at these big prints. You actually want to get them to scale. And then how do you facilitate that? You probably don't want a mouse. If you do choose to have a mouse interface, you want to do that maybe explicitly. Like the web app is on the landing and interface experience, but it's outside of the main room, so it doesn't compete with all the screens which are actually objects. So it's like making lots of those really specific decisions in the format. And I think that reduces the distraction of it, and so it's not like this thing in the corner of your eye, but it's more like, oh, that fits into this wall. And but that's a hard conversation to have, and I think more entrenched museums with, you know, galleries that haven't changed design in like 60 years and things like that.
Well, but, you know, again, I think if you're thinking carefully about it, it's not as controversial. I was just thinking that what you were saying is making me think about something that unfortunately we ended up just the project budget couldn't support it, but at the Met in the Arts of the Arab Lands gallery, there's a huge textiles gallery. And one thing that we had discussed, which would have been so great, but was basically, I mean, like a giant, like high def, like ultra high def screen, basically in the middle, that would allow you to basically, like, in effect, stretch a rug at 1-to-1 resolution, at actual size, things that are in our collection that we
But
are
that
not
aren't
on
in the
display,
space. Oh, that'd be,
but that you would see it at the real size that it exists. It's, like, I think that would have been like, half the Met's operating budget for the year to do that.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a situation where it's like, that's an experience where you can kind of only have it that way, but it would have taken advantage of sort of the flexibility of that digital material while at the same time, putting a pretty firm emphasis on, well, there's a very clear reason for this to exist in the gallery space.
Do you have any questions from the audience?
So this talk about digital media has a lot to do with interactivity, and it's part of this, you mentioned that briefly, this larger picture of a more visitor-focused museum experience, and about interactivity. And I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to speak a little bit about how digital interactives might inform or communicate with analog type of interactives, whether it's a game or a drawing activity or a manipulative kind of label. And when you're designing these digital things, do you think about those components as well, or is there ever a moment where you're like, this would work better with paper and pencil, or that kind of thinking? Anyone has?
Well, we do a lot of both. So I mean, sure. So we do a fair amount of digital stuff, but we also do. So in interpretation, we have public programming, so programming that's mainly for adult audiences. And part of what we do also is that we do create a fair amount of printed material. The things, and some of it is stuff like, here are the schedule of programs for the next quarter or whatever. But a lot of the things that we do are, everything from scavenger hunts for adults, because mostly what you get are the printed ones for kids or families, and so we do them actually for adults, so that we don't call them scavenger hunts, but they're basically scavenger hunts, because adults want to feel like they're doing grown-up things, so we call them something else. But so I mean that sort of thing of having, which is essentially a game, right? And so we do a fair amount of that stuff. We actually had we ended up not doing it this time. We had a long discussion. I think we're going to do it for a different exhibition about possibly doing something that is essentially an exquisite corpse game for an exhibition that we had, and it ended up not sort of working out for that exhibition, but we're probably going to do it for a future one. So we actually do a lot of those things as well, where we are kind of saying, hey, like, you can just do this paper and pencil, and that's totally fine. And I think a lot of what happens is that we kind of talk through, like, what are the goals of this, and what are we trying to get out of it, and how is this going to work? How are people going to know that it's there? We want to have things that are super low entry points. So like, hey, if we give you the paper, all you really need to come up with is an implement to write with, which a lot of people have with them. Versus you have to have a phone with you, or you have to have the time to download it, or all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah, there are like a ton of examples of, and you said exquisite corpse, and I was writing it down before you said it, because MoMA did a small event when they had their, I don't know, a year ago maybe, a late night surrealist opening, and the event, the only bits of technology that was there was like an overhead projector, and everyone just came, did 3 pieces of an exquisite corpse, or 1 piece, or however many, and they all got thrown into 3 buckets, and they would just pull 3 out, project it onto a big wall, and like you totally could have gotten caught up before the design of that and been like, oh, let's make it on your phone, and you send it over to a server, and then it like shows up on a screen, and then we can have it on our Twitter account or our Instagram, and we can show that, and like that would have been way more complicated than it needed to be, and kind of, I mean, like a lot of the exquisite corpse stuff was about happenings and people being in the same place at once. So like it would also be, if they acknowledged it, then it wouldn't be as disingenuous, but it could have really easily been like, oh, let's just make this a tech thing. SF MoMA does like game design jams all the time, and they're like 95% on pen and paper, even though a bunch of techie people show up.
We actually just scheduled a series of game jams for next year. So.
Yeah, and like that's, there's definitely, I mean, I program all the time. I'm a developer, but like 90% of the time that I'm spending free time programming is actually pulling things away from computers and into physical spaces, and like it's the design constraints of doing that, of not having an infinite screen or infinite zoom or an infinite amount of text you can put into place, really just make people get it like a lot quicker.
Do you guys feel that almost like the framework of a game helps us think more? Like, it seems like museums do a better job at balancing the digital and the non-digital in game design and gameplay. Like, as soon as sort of like learning goals come into play, like we get, it's like it's either all digital or it's not digital at all.
I think
like,
that has to do with the nature. It has to do with the nature of games,
Yeah.
because and it has to do with the nature of museums in parallel. So one of the most outstanding features of a game is that it's voluntary, and so it has to be a good experience for you to want to do it. Like, there's nothing worse than a bad game. Like, you just won't play a bad game.
Bad stand-up comedy is worse.
Because you can't leave. You can't just turn the Nintendo off. Like, it's this awkward thing back there. But no. So, and I think that like unless you're dragged there for school, like you go to museum because you want to go to a museum. So they have to be kind of voluntary, like experiences that are engaging and keep your attention and that you want to be there. Otherwise, you just leave and you go get a hot dog.
I think at heart, what you've just brought up is also one of the things that becomes a challenge for museums, because often I think in the conversations that we have about like we're going to do something that's going to have a game structure, like that often becomes, okay, so which age group between 5 and 17 are we like gearing this to, because it's a game, therefore it's for kids, and if it's going to be for kids, there has to be a learning outcome.
Except that most casual gamers are adults, and more women play games than men. It's all those like
all of us. So like that. I find that's the turn that the conversation often has, and for my department, like we're working with adults, and there's 5 of us in the department, and 4 of us are gamers, either analog or online or computer in some way. So like, we talk a lot about games, like, and so we think a lot about how how adults interact with games, and that, but it's not always it can be a difficult conversation to have, because the problem is that the minute you say game, then people think play, and the minute they say play, then they think adults don't want to play, and it's like, that's actually wrong. But and then people get worried, like, wait, you're going to make the exhibition, the collection, whatever, a play thing, and then then it becomes something
It's
where
not
people
serious.
Ironically, there's whole departments for audience engagement, and the games are amazingly engaging. So
That's
it's like,
great. But it's a lot easier to have.
well, it's not even game.
kids.
So I think the other problem is talking about games. I wrote an article about using gamic structures to rebuild curricular approaches, and how do you subtly shift syllabi to get people to not realize they're going through a course into games. Like, how do you get voluntary interest based on the ways that keep us interested in playing games? And I think that's like, how do you just develop experiences that aren't like, oh, like I'm playing Galaga, but it's all like Olmec heads. It's like, how do you pull apart those theoretical things that make games functions, and then employ them in a way that gets away from the kind of over-intellectualizing museums can have.
I think the most important thing is, and Jennifer, you implied this, but I think everyone would agree, is that there is not one best way.
Yeah, right.
There's a kind of imperative that sometimes suggests that, like, oh, digital, that's the best way to reach audiences. Well, I don't know.
Which audiences?
Which audience? And I'll give you just a spatial example, because we have a ground floor, and most of the exhibits are on the second floor. The ground floor was designed to be kind of, we call it sampling MIT. It's intended to be more trade show, simple. First iteration, we put all these great videos in. We worked really hard because people loved our videos upstairs. They said, oh, great, video. Don't worry about labels, text, just have good videos. Next to those zebrafish that I showed you yesterday, there was wonderful videos going through the lab, nothing more than 35 seconds. It was beautiful. Nobody pushed them except for me when I would take people through on a tour. But the flip book next to it, filled with laminated pages of the dense scientific article and some pictures of people, everybody touched that. So
Yeah.
that was interesting. But nobody, what we realized is the problem with the videos on the ground floor is people saw this as a preliminary to their experience, that the real museum was upstairs, and that if they started watching videos, they might
Oh, wow.
spend too much time here before they got into the real museum. And,
That's awesome insight.
you know, and so one of
It's
the
a
things
threshold rather than actually an experience kind of thing. Yeah, you behave differently in threshold.
You know, so it's like, you know, I gotta hang up my coat and
Get inside.
Move on.
get inside. And I've wondered with Gallery One, if that is viewed as a destination unto itself, is it, you know, like if that's enough to say you went to the Cleveland
people.
Museum of Art, or how that's affected the
For some-
rest of the museum.
For some visitors, that is, I mean, I think particularly the studio play, which is the area that was designed for families with younger children. There are families that come every single week at the same time, and they show up, they got the kid in the stroller, park the stroller, we have the stroller parked in there, and then we, you know, do some of the games, we have games in there, we have other kind of physical manipulatives, there's a creative area, and they'll come and that's where they go, and they may or may not ever make it into any other part of the museum.
Fascinating.
And, you know, so for some people, that is the destination. For some people, it's just a stop in their visit. And, I mean, I think that it gets back to, you know, as you said, there's not any right way to do it. It's like whatever is the way that works for you, that's the right way. Short of touching things, you can't do that.
So that is actually out of the question.
What?
I know that a rare book curator in Belgium who's right now preparing a Livre d'Artiste exhibit at the Gaulier Club. And he did years ago a Livre d'Artiste exhibit in Paris, which now also traveled to the MIPL. And I know that he said so that he has a huge fight with his library directors because he said, I have enough of these books. I want when people come and look at my book exhibit, also they have the possibility of actually going through a number of these books, and I design my exhibit in such a way that I have a few of them that are low cost, if you want to call it like that, that I put them out that people can touch and do not only see all of these books that are in some ways designed to be touched behind glass.
So I think the issue with that in my museum specifically is that we actually only have like the one Caravaggio.
I do understand that.
You know, there's not like a.
Have it a game, scratch the Caravaggio.
Right, exactly. So we went and got the cheaper Caravaggio. Stuck that one out, and you could just do whatever. But yeah, I mean.
Pin the mustache on the Caravaggio.
We actually, though, have one problem with this, and it's why most, but not all museums will not sell, say, surplus materials in their gift shop, is that you don't want to confuse people.
Yeah.
There is sometimes that if you can touch here, we've had exhibits where you're allowed to touch and then some places where you can't touch, and it's very confusing to the
People
visitor.
feel like they
They're
really
like, what? But
Well, if you go down the street, there's an exhibition that's you're allowed to touch everything, and another exhibition where everything's behind
Where everything's
plexiglass.
behind-
Yeah.
and it becomes actually.
But are
it's a
those books on
huge-
sale in the lobby?
Please touch
It's-
with wallet.
It's a huge, it was a huge part of the discussion that we had with Gallery One. I mean, like huge and long, and continued on forever and ever and ever. This idea that, okay, you get these touch screens in here, you're telling people to touch things, they're then going to touch the art because they're not going to see the distinction between the screen and the art. And that this was, you know, it was like this huge issue of
Interesting.
discussing
Really
what is this.
interesting.
And what's interesting is that in the evaluation, so when we initially opened, there was a Richard Long piece that was in the center of the gallery, and called Cornwall Circle. It's a wonderful piece. But I mean, if you're, you may be familiar with Richard Long's work, but if you're not, it's this particular piece is a number of stones, and they are put in a circle, getting gradually higher toward the center. In the circle, like you get directions, it has to be this many feet wide, and if I remember correctly, I think the smallest it could be was like 12 feet across. It ended up, we had some issues with when it was the one place that it could be, it was getting sort of close to where people were sort of standing around watching other people interact with one of the lenses, one of the screens in there. And we eventually ended up pulling it out and we replaced it with a Fred Wilson chandelier, which is obviously not on the floor. And therefore, you know, some of that issue of like kind of interacting with the art in a way that was not okay went out the door. But one thing is that because it was stone, and the gallery one is in our Breuer building, the floor is actually stone, and it's a really similar stone. So, and so whenever anyone says, "Oh no, the children will touch it," I will tell you right now, adults are way, way, way worse than children. Way worse. Because the thing is that children, particularly children that are in school, that are sort of in a pre-K-12 situation, live with rules all the time. Whereas adults feel like I can make my own rules. So adults are actually much worse.
Especially in Cleveland.
But you would get, you know, there was a certain amount of touching. They are stone, so it wasn't like the end of the world when people were touching the stone. But there were some problems where people would go up and they want to know, like, is the stone attached to the floor? And the way that they would figure this out is that they would, like, nudge the stone with their foot. And so there was, like, a
That's
lot
awesome.
going on.
I think it's great.
And then because they were, and part of it is, it's a material that you're used to, right? It's stone. I touch stones all the time. It's the familiarity thing. Like, so this, it's not a big deal if I touch this. And that then did actually... There was some like kind of carryover to some other works of art where there was people were getting all on top of some of the things they shouldn't have been on top of. Once that piece came out, that stopped. So what's interesting is that there is not actually more touching going on in the space that has things that you are told to touch mixed in with things that you're not supposed to touch. It actually hasn't prompted that, and it hasn't really prompted, like, we're not getting a big bump in people touching in the regular galleries as well. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. The one thing that we do find interesting is that because there are all of these screens that are touch screens, we have one screen at the front that's called the Beacon, and it's like kind of playing like an introduction to the space and an introduction to Artlands, and it's the only thing that's not a responsive screen. And people go up and they're, why isn't this working?
People go to the Connect, which has a little sign that says stand back 4 feet, and they start trying to touch the screen. Yeah, I mean,
Because it gets back to the expectation thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
other things do magical
Yeah.
things. Why the hell won't this
Why
one
is
do
this
it?
not magical?
I think a
Put
big
a
part of
line
that
on
is
the floor.
the threshold thing.
That says
is-
stand here.
We- No, we have a line on the floor. We haven't put the feet, but there's a line on the
I
floor.
totally
People just
did.
walk
You
over
have
it.
to-
You have to put the little
I ignored the line
Yeah, no, we
on the
haven't-
floor.
it was
I
the little
didn't
feet we don't have yet, but yeah.
It's the little feet.
Especially during the opening, though, when there was no room, people are all over that
I know, it's
screen.
just-
I want to respond to your question because I think that it's part of what you asked is about the era we're in. That the one thing that digital media has done is they've really defamiliarized and changed our perception of a lot of things we took for granted. So the one thing I talk about a lot here is that when we do books, we forget they're designed objects. You know, the margins, the typography, the cover, they're transparent. You know, they're invisible almost because they're so old and they're so embedded in our way of understanding intellectual production. And what's happening now is you do the digital and they're like, whoa, the book's really designed. You know, like if I can do a project like David's in kind of an equivalent project, well, what can I do with my book? And so we ended up wire binding my book and it looks like a user's guide. And so that was a fun experience. But I think that the minute you have these mobile devices in an institution that has a pretty historically orthodox practice that you learn when you're like 3, like you go in the museum, you don't touch, you do X, Y, all like, I mean, maybe it's not just the digital media, but we are in an era of engagement and individualized self-discovery of information. And I think it's hard to say it's not because of the internet and mobile devices and digital devices in some way. So it begs a lot of, I'm not going to use that because apparently begs the question is actually the word, I'm learning that that's a logic fallacy, but that's another conversation. It starts asking a lot of questions of the things that we've taken for granted that are now getting ruptured, and people are more willing to individually rupture them. And how do you adapt to that, and not in a resistive way, but how do you kind of go with the flow to create new types of experiences? And then how do you also embrace that it shouldn't just be the digital kind of kick things off, but these are more historically anchored so that the analog can also solve those problems. You know, when we do our projects in the lab, you know, most of the first iterations happen on big white pieces of paper because it's easier to get a bunch of students around. It happens faster. You don't have to teach a bunch of students a tool to do the development thing, and they've never done that before. So I think there's this really interesting dialectic between the analog and the digital and the way it's revealing things that we were taking for granted, and it's giving us the opportunity to start pulling apart the kind of tight knit threads of these educative practices and institutional norms, and create new things. And so that's like the coolest part of this 2 days, is that a lot of stuff is up in the air that you probably couldn't have done before. And even the conversation, David and I hosted a symposium here called Artifact and Agent Media, connected to the class in 2010, and Coven was here, and like the conversation that day compared to today
It's very different.
was very different. Like so much more resistance. Like institutions being institutions, and so much is moving so fast, and that's that thread, that thing that you hit upon, that really is the important part of that. And it's fun, and that's why it's also, I don't think any of us likes over determining the word digital. It's like we're in this era where these tools are enabling a lot, but it's a larger social intellectual framework of changes.
I think it's really important that when Coben brought up in relation to like analog, that in gaming, right? Like, what do you think about games and how that opens things up, and also in wise, do people just have the Gallery 1 as their destination? And there's like a relatively old concept in games that called the magic square, which is like when you play a game, the first thing you do before you even pick up the controller, after you decide what you're going to play with whoever you're going to play with, is that you enter a magic square that's like a sandbox, and that you have decided to let go of certain rules and to abide by a certain set of new rules, and by framing
it's a voluntary
gallery,
thing,
and it's such a parallel to like when someone says gallery, like the instant image they think of a white box, like they're already changing their expectations, whether it's a person who wants to be told everything or a person who wants to discover on their own. Those are like different, but when people walk through that threshold, they're like, all right, something different's going to happen here. And like a lot of the concepts of what you can get away with and can't get away with, and how you teach, like touching, can you touch or not, red light, green light, 1, 2, 3, like you play that in the gallery with like a beautiful piece at the end of the hallway? No, like, but I bet you could, and and you can tell them to stop, and they can be an inch away, and like they won't touch it, right? So, I think that a lot of how do we get people to have their own agency but behave how they want to, like, is just in, thinking of your space as a game, even if there is no interaction, or even if it's all analog. Like, those design principles just hold true in gallery spaces. And there are a few artists that play around with that, of course. They say, yes, touch this art, and then like all the other pieces in the room are like, don't touch, and people get confused and angry.
So half an hour later, did we answer your question?
Actually, my follow-up was going to be about games and play, so it was such a natural.
Just as a side note, there's another kind of game. So in the scientific world, there's been a great deal of success that have been widely publicized with the use of games to help address certain scientific research questions. And so I have colleagues who are now completely in love with this idea. So this is a variation on the learning object, is now we're contributing to science. You're not playing a game because it's fun. You're contributing to the scientific venture, and that somehow makes
humanity.
Games okay, and positive. So if that's helpful, perhaps,
I'm like, let's just play games because games are fun.
Well, I actually, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Let me vamp for 20 more minutes before. But I actually wonder if the thing about games is just that, like, as soon as you say games, we very quickly start defining audiences in a way that we just don't with lots of other experiences. I mean, like, when you say, we need to do some interpretation in this period room, the implied audience is everybody. Whereas a game, you immediately start narrowing it down, and you say, well, it's going to be this age group, and it's, it's early adopters of technology, or it's whatever. And I sort of feel like, I wonder if that's part of the reason that we get a better balance with gameplay sometimes than we do with others. Sorry, so that said, please.
Caitlin?
Where was that other question? Oh, sorry.
About, I guess, one thing to kind of consider, and I think it's a really important aspect in the balance between analog versus digital, is the extra sensory input, and that's a very valuable learning tool that, so even if it could be easier or more convenient to do something digital, making doing the effort to have the analog as that, to get those extra inputs and like the tactile nature of it. And it's, especially for objects, and as conservation obviously is like such a big issue. If you think of like instruments and having an instrument, or computers and it's just sitting against the wall, and that it's almost meaningless in the sense of like how it really would have been appreciated in its use, because you're not getting these extra sensory inputs.
It's an interesting point. I don't know if I am now not going to remember his name. There is we were just talking about this yesterday. There is this research has been done at the Smithsonian out of their office of something that I can't remember either. I'm having a hard time here. That basically looks at audiences and has sort of looked at different ways of thinking about what the motivation is for why people go to museums, and therefore how that guides their experience. And you sort of think of like the work that Falk did in terms of thinking about the audiences. But this one out of the Smithsonian, there's an article that was in Curator a year or two ago that kind of explained this, and there's an acronym for it, which is IPOP, for the 4 sort of motivating groups, right? And it's ideas, people, objects, physical. And so, like, if you're an idea person, then you are going to engage in one particular way. If you're an object person, and we all have all of those things in our personalities, but usually have something that's dominant. And so the one that art museums in particular have a really hard time with is physical, because sort of by definition, you're probably not really going to get to physically or have that tactile experience with the objects. And so it really is a challenge. It's something to really, that I think as institutions, and I also think that as institutions, we generally take the out of like, well, you can't touch our objects. Well, that's not the only way that can work. So, I think it's a really good point to bring that up, of that having that experience with the analog can kind of fulfill some of that need, particularly for people that's one of the more dominant motivations, is that they really need to have that kind of tactile experience.
On the other hand, I own paintings at home, and I don't go and routinely, touch them, even though I'm allowed, right? I own them, but.
But you do other things to fulfill that tactile experience.
But that's right. But I think we sometimes we focus so much on the object that we forget that there are other ways to create visceral, tactile, emotional experiences in those spaces that don't require
touching the object.
This particular object.
I think it's also like, not to just do things for the sake of things, and I don't think any of us are talking about that, but part of the idea of, I think, the tactile in the museum is to do it in a way that highlights why other things aren't touchable. So that you're actually informing, so the educative practice that tells us to not touch is not just a kind of an embedded unfortunate one, but one that is contextual, that tells us something about the object. It's a conservation issue. It's like, this is part of our cultural heritage. If you touch it, you're assaulting that cultural heritage. To be pretty intense, but that's really the story behind why we don't touch those objects. Sometimes those things are also not touchable for reasons that are institutionally unnecessary, right? So if you can lower those thresholds, and then if you can start creating an intellectual conversation with the visitor about that, then the kinds of touching you can provide that tell a story about those objects that are untouchable, that's really valuable.
Yeah.
That's what I was kind of getting at. It's like it's okay for the Met for MoMA to have that computer back there, but there's more than that than they're doing with that device, and they're not doing that device justice by only doing that. And so this is the counter to that. Right. And together they work really well together. It's like COVID, you asked me yesterday. It's like, what if I had the last object on Earth? And I was like, put it on a plant covered in plastic. Don't let anyone touch it, right? Yeah. But then if you had like another one next to it they could touch, they'd understand why they can't touch that one. And I think that's where the real power is. Like, what are we doing in these institutions? What are the goal we want the audiences to leave with? And then how do you aim all of these practices towards achieving that goal? And so the touching shouldn't just be so they'll come, right? Like that's, then you're driven by audience and numbers, but it's really so they'll understand why you can't touch that. And we're doing a lot with conservation here. Like I said, I was new to material culture, I'm new to conservation, and the conversations we've had at the BGC have been really robust in opening those things up to everyone here. And our next project in the Focus Gallery has been fraught with this history of film and its preservation, and like you should come back for that symposium, because that'll be another one. With perishable film from the 60s and 70s, and like why you can't touch it, but and why museums won't let it out and why they will, and but I think that's where we should always be engaging with, like, what is the educative didactic practice that we want to do with all of these things, and how do we best enable like the comprehensiveness, and how does the digital become part of that?
I guess almost like deciding whether, or thinking of the museum as the temple, the like educational institution, or somewhere in between.
Yeah.
I just don't know why it's not built into the practice of museums to constantly be making replicas of their pieces, if of functional pieces more than not. Because like the weight of carrying a heavy water jug, I think, is a more satisfying and interesting experience than being able to touch a painting. For various reasons, right? But like, why isn't that just part of?
Because there's reasons why you don't make replicas, and that should be part of the same
Right,
course of education and study, right?
All these questions, I know that the Arms and Armor at the Met have a whole bunch of items that are like, these are the ones you touch, these are the ones you don't. They are distinguished from each other just in like origin and craftsmanship and things like that. But it's part of their culture, because a lot of their items were functional, and because of the person who founded the department, who wanted people to have these things in their hands, whereas every department, every museum's different, and like to push forward the idea that like, yeah, fine, we can have a replica object, and that'll bring a bunch of questions to the public and spark good conversation. Like that, I don't know. I think that people could do more of that.
I mean, I think one thing at Cleveland, we're actually in a very lucky position in that we have a separate collection that is the education collection, that is one that you can interact with. And that collection started before we even opened as a parallel collection, and at one point was almost as large as the regular collection. We did some deaccessioning over the last few years. And it is things like one of the more popular pieces is in fact the gauntlet. But we also have a lot of objects that are in categories that are not functional. So there are prints, there are paintings, there are sculptures, there are all sorts of things in that collection, as well as things that are more functional. And we have a couple of programs where, like one that goes into schools, where they bring the objects into schools and the students can interact with them. And then we also have one that's art cart, and we'll roll out carts with these objects into the galleries, and then anyone using a pair of white gloves can interact with them. So I mean, I think we're in a special position. We have this collection that is now 100 years old. Not everyone has been collecting objects for 100 years with the explicit idea that somebody's going to be able to interact with it. But I mean, I do think like the idea of making replicas, there are all sorts of, this is a totally fraught issue that could go on and on and on. But I also think that like there is potential in things like 3D printing to where you can kind of skirt around some of the replica issues.
Well, open up a whole bunch of issues.
Well, other issues, but I mean, the idea
But it starts
of
the conversation.
But we're doing that with our plan collection, so,
Yeah.
and people have used it both seriously and for
playfully, right?
So
Sure.
people used to have to, they want to make a brass or bronze fitting for a ship, and we have the plans. It's a very complicated thing to sculpt and carve and then, create the molds and pour. And now, the laser goes, zzz, zzz, and then you 3D print it, and, presto, you've got the mold. That's amazing. And that kind of use will come into play. I think there's a whole commercial side of museums that we have not confronted, in that we just accessioned 400 19th century architectural molds, plaster molds. Well, the possibility of making those available for people doing restorations and so forth is really great. But that's an area of commerce we haven't really haven't really thought very much about it, and I think there will be increasing pressure on museums to find ways to commercialize pieces of their collection for the purpose of sustaining their operations, or but also to make them accessible. I mean, if it's cultural patrimony, you say you're preserving it for the world, then why shouldn't they use it? So there's those things are coming.
I got really
Yeah.
excited and then really sad after MoMA, they acquired and released the code for Planetary, which is like, okay, great. They released the code for an app, and then did Planetary, and then quickly after, or around the same time, MoMA started collecting not the plans or the objects or the like source material, but just the design of a bunch of video games. So they acquired some of the designs, but not the code.
The design was like a picture of Super Mario.
Yeah.
Like, how do you acquire the
it's-
design of a video game?
or like the trademark of of these it's like acquiring Blick colors, you know. It's this weird, but there was a chance that they could allow people to not have to reverse engineer these old machines, but acquire all the documents and then just open up the documents to the public. Of course, they wouldn't have been able to acquire any of them without an explicit agreement that, oh, no, we will not share your secrets, right?
Yeah.
So then there was this weird disconnect between, we're acquiring the design. Well, great, so you can exhibit it and no one else can, and that's the only thing you got out of this. I'm sure there are many more details I'm leaving out, and I hope to be corrected by Paula or anyone else, but like that is in stark contrast to, oh hey, we have these plans and now we can use them both to sustain the sustain the museum and share for enthusiasts and people who are doing replicas.
I will add that for the big boat plans, we have very elaborate liability disclaimers. Because
You'll have to sue us if you sink.
that's right. No joke. I mean, you know,
That's
if this
right.
blows up on you, you know. So I don't know about others in this room. I spend an enormous chunk of time dealing with intellectual property rights, trying to sort those out, thread all kinds of needles. With that, just down the street, Time wants to publish an Edgerton photo in, you know, all media, known and unknown, yet to be invented in all parts of the universe here, now, you know, and beyond, you know, forever and ever. And you're like, oh, no.
Well, since you both talked about explosions and invoked intellectual property, which kills every conversation with digital, I think we're gonna call a close to the conversation. And I want to thank everyone for 2 wonderful days of symposia. I want to thank the panel, Kovin, David, Jennifer, Jonathan, and Deborah. This has far exceeded expectations. I think this last panel was a huge array of things. I love that we got down to the fact that so much of these questions are still material and physical, and that's what these institutions are very much still about, and the digital challenges and opens up those questions in a way that refreshes our discourse. I want to thank the audience, which has been great,
Thanks for the great
and for the patience with our insanity. And so the streaming will be up soonish, next week I believe that they get out there. And thank you very much for everything. Thank you to the BGC, it's all here and around us, for allowing us to do these things, and have a wonderful afternoon.